My name is Avery Holbrook, 32 years old. The plate didn't shatter so much as explode, porcelain petals skittering across the tile. Then came his voice, clipped and parade ground clean. Either you serve my wife under this roof, or you leave my house. He didn't need to shout. My father never needed volume. He had rank. He had the kind of presence that made even door frames stand straighter. I wasn't a recruit anymore. Roast beef steamed between us like an offering at the altar of his order. Elaine stood by the counter with one hand on a wine glass, as if it were a trophy she'd just earned, nails lacquered like hazard lights. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. My father looked only at me, square, cold, certain, his eyes the same gray as his old flight jacket. "If you live here," he said, "you live by my rules. She's your superior under this roof." The words landed harder than bullets ever had. I didn't argue. The truth is, I had been arguing with him since I was 12, and he corrected how I folded a bedsheet. I nodded once, the kind of acknowledgement that happens in a cockpit when the air is thin and the stakes are high. Then I turned and walked upstairs. My duffel, the same one that had crossed oceans and deserts, waited like an old friend. I folded clothes with the precision he taught me, slid in my toothbrush, my VA card, a photo of Mom that still smelled like sunlight in my memory. When I came down, he followed me to the doorway but didn't move to stop me. He never moved to stop me. The night air hit my face like salt in an open cut. I didn't look back at the window where Elaine might be watching. The drive out of Arlington was a silver ribbon under a hard November sky, rain turning the world into a smeared watercolor. I let the wipers set the tempo for my heart. Somewhere near Fredericksburg, a diner sign blinked. Open. Flicker, flicker, like a tired eye. I pulled in, drank coffee black enough to hide in, and stared at a flag snapping on its pole. I had saluted that flag 1,000 times, but I had never felt lonelier under it than I did right then. "Where are you headed?" the waitress asked, pouring without being asked. "Norfolk," I said. "Military. Used to be." I didn't tell her my father called sailors floaters and women in uniform publicity. I didn't tell her that when I made officer, he sent a 2-word email, "Be careful." I didn't tell her I learned to be careful before I learned to braid my hair. I slept in the car behind the diner, rain fretting at the roof like restless fingers. At dawn, I kept going. The apartment I found near the Naval Pier had thin walls and a fridge that hummed like a stubborn engine, but the landlord, a Vietnam vet with skin like weathered leather, knocked 100 off the rent when he saw my service record. "We look out for our own," he said, shaking my hand in a way that made my knuckles ache with something close to gratitude. I unpacked only what mattered. A uniform I wasn't sure I'd wear again, medals that felt too heavy for the space, Mom's photo in a cheap frame. In the picture, she's laughing at something I can't remember, hair pulled back, eyes crinkled at the corners. Calm knowing is how I'd always described her. The kind of knowing people mistake for softness until they try to push against it. On the second morning, I ran the waterfront. Diesel and salt in the air, gulls screeching like broken radios. My knee twinged where shrapnel still whispered during storms, but motion felt like sanity. Fishermen nodded. The way men do when words fail. I wasn't Lieutenant Commander Holbrook out there. I was just a woman running, because stillness would split me. By the third day, I had a temp contract at the Veteran Outreach Center, transport coordination, benefits paperwork, phone calls to families who'd stopped answering. The pay didn't matter. Purpose did. The first vet who sat across from me was a Marine named Travis, 2 fingers gone, and most of his hope with them. "No one gives a damn once you're out," he said, eyes on the floor. I do. I didn't soften it. I just said it like an order and a promise in the same breath. At night, I ironed my Navy jacket, not because I planned to wear it, but because the rhythm of steam and fabric steadied the noise inside. My father used to say, "Order is how we survive chaos." I had believed him. For a long time, I used his definition of order as a tourniquet, tight enough to numb, never loose enough to feel. A week after I left, an old Air Force buddy of his sent me a casual email. "Saw your dad, looked tired, guess that new wife is running him ragged." I deleted it. Pride is hereditary, but so is the ache you get when you realize you've inherited the wrong parts. Sometimes, in the quiet, I replayed that night. The flash of porcelain, the click of his jaw locking, the exact shape his hand made around authority. In the replay, I always said something clever that made him flinch. In reality, I did the only thing that ever got through to him: silence. On the 10th night, a storm came off the Atlantic with the kind of fury that makes windows ask questions. Wind howled in the ducts. I sat on the floor, back to the bed, knees up like I was bracing for impact. The phone lit once with an unknown number. I let it ring into the dark. Then again. Then again. By the time it stopped, there were 48 missed calls. 48. The man who had once sworn he'd never beg. The father who told me to leave his house, who had measured my worth by how straight my corners folded. 48 calls burning like flares in a black sky. I didn't pick up. I told myself it wasn't revenge. Revenge is a sharp, childish thing that burns out fast. This was different. This was me checking a perimeter I had learned to trust. Is the threat real? Am I safe? What does breaking silence cost me that I haven't already paid? I powered the phone off and listened to the storm run out of ammunition. In the morning, the parking lot glittered with puddles pretending to be small seas. I made coffee the way the Navy taught me, strong enough to salute, and opened the blinds. Out in the harbor, gray ships sat like the backs of sleeping animals. Stillness is an illusion, they teach you. Even when a ship looks still, systems hum, gauges tick, people breathe. The world moves underneath. I tried to move. I unlocked the center early and began sorting case files. The walls were lined with faded posters, only veterans read, "Honor never retires," "Service is forever." I hate slogans, but some truths don't need poetry. Around noon, the director, Mrs. Dalton, a retired nurse with sharp eyes and a kindness you could dent a car against, knocked on my door without knocking. "You've been running full throttle since you got here," she said, setting a sandwich on my desk. "Idle hands," I said. "Or maybe you're outrunning something." I didn't answer. I took a bite to prove I wasn't made of metal. The afternoon slid by in forms and phone calls, the kind of labor that stitches people back together one policy number at a time. Underneath it, a hum I pretended not to hear, 48 unanswered, blinking like a lighthouse I refused to look at. When my shift ended, I walked the pier until the sun bled orange into the bay. A destroyer moved toward the horizon, engines a low, patient heartbeat. The sight tugged at something old. The discipline that once held me together, and the belonging that once made the cost worth it. I thought of the letter folded in my desk, Navy Medical Board, cleared for limited, active status upon completion of physical therapy. Freedom disguised as a choice. A gull landed near my boot and cocked its head as if waiting on my decision. "Yeah," I told it. "Me neither." Back at the apartment, rice and eggs felt like the kind of dinner you make when you don't want to admit you're hungry for anything else. The quiet was echoey, the kind that makes you hear the inside of your own skull. I stared at the dead phone on the nightstand until the room felt smaller. Then I let sleep take me like a mercy. I dreamt of the kitchen I left, the clock ticking too loudly, Elaine's perfume musculing the air, my father's voice stripping the walls. In the dream, I wasn't leaving. I was 10 again, standing at attention while he inspected my room. "Corners, Avery," he barked. "A soldier's worth is in the corners." I tucked and retucked until my fingers went numb. He never looked at my hands. When I woke, sweat cooled fast on my back. I showered and braided my hair tight enough to quiet the tremor in my chest. Jeans instead of blues. Medals stay in the drawer. Camouflage is an art you keep, even when the war's over. At the center, Mrs. Dalton had already stacked a new pile of files on my desk. "We got 3 transports and a benefits appeal," she said. "Try to breathe between them." "Breathing is for civilians," I said. She laughed like a woman who has watched enough soldiers to know when they're lying. By mid-afternoon, I had almost convinced myself the calls were a glitch of grief and habit. I powered the phone back on because pretending not to own it felt childish. Notifications flooded like a breached hull, missed calls, unknown number, voicemail. My thumb hovered, then landed. "Miss Holbrook, this is Linda from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm trying to reach you regarding your father, Colonel Richard Holbrook. He's been admitted since last night. Please call us back as soon as possible." The room tilted. I put the phone face down on the desk as if it might bite. My first thought wasn't what happened. It was, where's Elaine? I replayed the message twice. Not because I missed any words, but because hearing them again might make them mean something else. They didn't. When I looked up, Mrs. Dalton was in the doorway, reading the new landscape of my face, the way a medic reads a field. "Everything all right?" "Family business," I said. "The hardest kind," she answered, and left me to decide what kind of daughter I planned to be. I drove without telling myself to. Highway signs blurred to verbs: go, merge, yield. I merged with dread. I yielded to a muscle memory I had promised not to use on him again. By the time I reached Arlington, the parking lot lamps were flickering on. The hospital doors breathed open. Antiseptic hit like a deployment memory. Controlled chaos, measured in beeps instead of mortar timing. "Colonel Holbrook?" the nurse repeated. "ICU. He's stable, but you should talk to the doctor." She didn't ask about Elaine. She didn't need to. The empty chair at his bedside would answer. When I stepped into his room, I felt two griefs collide. The man who had filled every doorway lying small in a bed that didn't care who he used to be, and the daughter who had learned to be steel because softness got misfiled as weakness. Machines hummed a monotonous lullaby. His skin looked thinner, his jaw softer. I stood with my arms folded like armor I couldn't put down. "You always said soldiers don't whine," I whispered to the air between us. "You forgot to add fathers to the list." His eyelids dragged open. For a heartbeat, he didn't know me. Then he did. In that moment, something passed between us that hadn't in years, recognition without victory. "She's gone," he rasped. "Elaine took everything." I didn't smile, not even inside. Some truths don't taste like triumph. They taste like the end of a long, bad drill you didn't realize you'd been running all your life. I pulled the chair closer and sat. He closed his eyes again, and the monitors kept time for us. Outside the glass, the sky turned the color of bruised fruit. My phone blinked once on the tray. 48 missed calls, one message, a future I hadn't prepared for knocking without etiquette. I didn't pick up, not yet. Sometimes silence isn't revenge. It's preparation for the moment you finally answer, and you only get to answer once. The morning after the call, I woke before dawn. The air in my apartment felt too thin, like someone had opened a vent to nowhere. Coffee didn't help. Neither did pretending that I had a choice. When the first streak of light broke through the blinds, I packed a bag, checked the mirror, and saw the same steady face I used to wear before deployments. Detached. Functional. Not brave. Just ready to move. The drive to Arlington blurred into muscle memory. Every mile took me closer to a man I wasn't sure I could still talk to. I tried the hospital once, half hoping no one would pick up. They did. "Colonel Holbrook is stable," the nurse said. "You might want to come soon." Stable, a word people used when they didn't know how to say fragile. St. Mary's Hospital stood like a fortress of glass and fluorescent ghosts. The lobby smelled of bleach and grief. I signed in under next of kin before I could talk myself out of it. The elevator hummed upward, slow as regret. When the doors opened, I braced for whatever version of him waited on the other side. He looked smaller, not just thinner, smaller in presence, like the air no longer obeyed him. Tubes coiled from his arms. Machines whispered numbers that would have meant nothing to the soldier he'd been. I stood in the doorway, hand on the frame. For a long moment, I couldn't move. "Sir?" I said finally, because old habits die harder than pride. His eyelids twitched. The voice that came out was more rasp than sound. "You came." "You called," I said quietly, 48 times. He gave a faint smile that broke halfway through. "Didn't think you'd answer." "I didn't," I admitted. "Not until now." Silence pressed between us, thick as the oxygen hiss. I wanted to ask what happened, but the answer hung in the emptiness around him. Elaine. Gone. So I asked the only thing I could. "What do you need?" He stared at the ceiling. "Forgiveness," he murmured. "Maybe to God, maybe to me." I didn't respond. Forgiveness wasn't a thing you could hand over like paperwork. It was earned in quiet, over time, in the kind of hours we'd never shared. The doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "He's recovering from cardiac stress," she explained softly. "Physically, he'll manage. Emotionally..." She glanced at me. "That's between you two." Then she left us with the hum of the monitors and a truth I didn't want to carry. When he drifted back to sleep, I sat in the chair and looked at his hands. Hands that had written orders, raised medals, pointed out my mistakes. They looked fragile now, veins like road maps on worn paper. I wondered if he'd ever felt human before this, or if command had always been his disguise. Hours passed. Nurses moved in and out. I made calls to insurance, to the VA, to anyone who would listen to the word veteran and still care. It gave me something to do other than feel. When I returned to his room that evening, a Bible sat open on his tray, the pages turned by a hand that trembled. My father hadn't touched a Bible since my mother's funeral. I touched the chair back. Trying something new? His voice was weak but steady. Trying something old. That night, I checked into a cheap motel a few blocks away. The walls buzzed with distant TV static, and the window looked out on a parking lot slick with rain. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for anger that never came. What I felt instead was exhaustion, the kind that seeps into bone, heavier than resentment. By morning, I was back at the hospital. I signed more forms, fetched coffee, and ignored the nurse's knowing look. When she called me a good daughter, I almost laughed. Daughters were built from affection. What we had was duty. At noon, the doctor told me he'd need at least another week of rest. "We'll need a point of contact," she said. "I'll handle it," I replied before thinking. When I returned to his room, he was awake, eyes on the window. "You don't have to stay," he said, voice thin, but full of command. "Neither did Elaine," I answered. The words landed sharp enough to make him flinch. He looked away, shame flickering like static on a broken screen. The next afternoon, I drove to his house to collect essentials. The key still fit, but the air on the other side felt foreign. Curtains drawn, lights off. A faint trace of her perfume lingered, sour and sweet, like something spoiling. Her touch was everywhere. Gold-framed mirrors, embroidered pillows, wine glasses lined up like soldiers on parade. And yet beneath all of it, the house smelled of dust and neglect. The living room looked staged, not lived in. I crossed to the fireplace. His old Air Force trunk sat open, medals scattered inside, photos torn. One stopped me cold, my parents on their wedding day. Her smile easy, his posture proud. A crack ran right through their joined hands, like the photo itself had decided to tell the truth. In the kitchen, unpaid bills littered the counter. Electricity, mortgage, final notice. And one note in looping cursive, "You should have listened, Richard. Pride doesn't pay bills. No signature, no goodbye, just contempt." I folded it and slipped it into my jacket, not for evidence, but as a reminder of what pride costs when it finally runs out of credit. When I got back to the hospital, he was sitting upright, studying that same Bible. The nurse whispered that he'd refused lunch. I set the bag on the chair beside him. "Your clothes," I said, "and something else." He didn't look up. "Find her?" "No," I said, "but I found what she left behind." He didn't ask. Maybe he already knew. For a while, neither of us spoke. The machines filled the silence, rhythmic, almost tender. Then, quietly, he said, "You were right." I looked up. "About what?" "About her." I shook my head. "No, Dad, I wasn't right. I just stopped trying to prove you wrong." He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the lines on his face looked less like age and more like surrender. Later that night, Mrs. Dalton called to check in. Her voice was soft but precise, the way medics speak when the patient isn't the only one bleeding. "How's he holding up?" "Alive," I said. "Angry, proud, the usual." "And you?" "Functional." She chuckled sadly. "That's military for breaking quietly." "Then I'm fluent," I replied. After I hung up, I sat by his bedside until the lights dimmed. He slept like men do, when the fight's not over, but they've run out of ammunition. I studied the rise and fall of his chest, the fragility of it, and thought of every war he'd fought that never made it into a report, his wife's death, his remarriage, the daughter he couldn't command. When the nurse came to check vitals, she found me still there, staring out the window at the city lights reflecting off wet pavement. "He's lucky you came," she said. I didn't correct her. Lucky wasn't the word. By the time I left the hospital, the air had gone cold. My reflection in the glass doors looked like a ghost in uniform. On the drive back, I realized that I'd answered his 48 calls after all, just not the way he expected. That night, sleep came late and left early. In its place came the question I hadn't dared ask. What happens when the man who raised you on discipline has nothing left to command? 2 days later, the doctor cleared him for discharge. I drove him home. He paused in the doorway, hand trembling on the frame, eyes sweeping over the hollow house Elaine left behind. "You don't have to stay," he said again. I know, I replied, but you shouldn't be alone. He looked at me, really looked, and for the first time in years I saw something that resembled humility. You sound like your mother, he murmured. She'd have stayed too, I said. He nodded once and stepped inside. The house swallowed him whole, and I followed into the silence, unsure who was saving whom. The first morning back in that house, the air felt wrong, too still, like even the walls were waiting for orders. He was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in a pressed shirt, coffee untouched, posture straight enough to make the chair look guilty. His uniform discipline hadn't cracked, even if everything else had. Hospital says you need rest, I said, setting 2 mugs down. Rest is for the retired, he muttered. You are retired. He looked up, and for a flicker I saw the colonel again, the man who could level a room with a stare. Maybe, he said, but I'll be damned if I die in a chair. I didn't argue. Arguing with him was like shadowboxing a storm. You hit air and lose your footing anyway. So I cooked breakfast instead. He ate half a slice of toast, then went silent again, eyes on the window, watching nothing. Later, when I returned from the Veterans Center, the house looked unchanged, yet heavier. I caught him in the garage, surrounded by half-disassembled tools and engines that hadn't roared in years. He was trying to fix the lawnmower, knuckles scraped, oil staining his shirt. Engine's been stalling, he said without looking up. You just had a heart attack, Dad. He shrugged. It's just a motor. Needs air, fuel, spark, same as people. Except people brake differently. He didn't reply, just handed me a wrench. So I crouched beside him and we tightened bolts in silence. The rhythm was mechanical but strangely comforting, like 2 soldiers sharing the same trench after running out of things to say. When we finished, he leaned back, breathing hard. Elaine wanted me to sell all this, he said quietly. Said the garage made the place look like a junkyard. Guess that's the difference between junk and history. He laughed then, a short, brittle sound that seemed to surprise us both. The next morning, I left early for the outreach center. The building always smelled like burnt coffee and perseverance. Mrs. Dalton was there, sorting donation letters, her hair in its usual tight bun. Didn't expect you back so soon, she said. Needed to breathe, I replied. She studied me for a moment. You've got your father's jaw, she said, but your mother's eyes. That combination scares people. Good, I said, managing half a smile. By mid-morning, the place buzzed. Veterans filing in for counseling, benefits checks, hot meals. I slipped into my office and started paperwork, the kind that keeps emotions filed in alphabetical order. That's when the door creaked open and a familiar voice said, "Still fighting chaos with forms?" I looked up. Marcus Hawk Hill, 6'4", built like a rumor, tattooed with coordinates of every place we'd almost died. He grinned. Heard the Navy finally let you go. Temporarily, I said. They'll drag me back when they realize no one else color codes supply manifests. He laughed. Still the same. We caught up fast. Deployment stories, jokes. Only people who'd bled in sand understood. But when he mentioned my father, the humor thinned. I heard about what happened, he said carefully. Elena always felt off to me. Some people hide behind charm the way we hide behind armor. She didn't just rob him, I said. She dismantled him. And you? I'm fine. He smiled in that quiet way soldiers do when they recognize a lie. Sure you are. That afternoon, we hosted a workshop for younger vets, ostensibly about leadership after service, but mostly about how to live when structure disappears. When it was my turn to speak, I ditched the notes. Leadership doesn't end when the uniform comes off, I said. It begins when nobody has to salute you anymore. The room stilled. A kid, 25, nervous hands, raised his arm. Ma'am, what do you do when your own family stops respecting you? For a second, my throat closed. Then I said, you remember that respect isn't a gift. It's a mirror. You can't make someone look into it, but you can keep it clean until they do. Mrs. Dalton whispered later, you should write that down. I didn't. Some truths only work in the moment. When I came home that night, the house was quiet again. He was in the garage, same chair, same light buzzing overhead. Everything okay? I asked. Trying to keep busy. That's new, I said. Idle hands, he replied, echoing my own excuse from days before. The irony didn't escape either of us. We fixed nothing important that evening, just tightened bolts, wiped oil, shared air. He told me stories from the Air Force days. Night flights over Europe, men who never made it home, the first time he saw Mom. His voice cracked halfway through that one, so he started talking about maintenance procedures instead. The next morning, he was up early again, coffee mug in hand, staring at the wall. You going to the center? He asked. Yeah. Good. Keep doing something that matters. For a man like him, that was an apology disguised as permission. At the center, Mrs. Dalton met me at the door. We got a few new intakes today, she said. One of them's tough. PTSD, drinking problem, refuses to trust anyone. Thought of you. Lucky me. By lunch, Marcus had joined me with files under his arm. You're predictable, he said. So are you. He shrugged. Maybe predictability's underrated. When I got home that evening, my father was watching an old military documentary. Planes roaring off carriers, crews saluting. His eyes followed the jets like ghosts leaving orbit. Miss it? I asked. You never stop missing the sound of purpose, he said. I hesitated in the doorway. You could come by the center, meet some of the retired officers, talk. He shook his head. Those groups are for people who need to talk. I'm fine. Right, I said, because fine is a strategy. He almost smiled. Now you sound like a commander. Learn from the best, I replied. The next day the phone rang. A clipped voice, official tone. Is this Lieutenant Commander Holbrook? Yes. This is Detective Monroe, Financial Crimes Division. We've located a forged signature in your father's real estate records. We believe Elaine Holbrook executed an illegal sale of property. We'll need a statement. I thanked him, hung up, and felt the room tilt. Another layer peeled away from whatever pride my father had left. That night, I found him in the garage again, hands shaking as he tried to polish a metal that no longer gleamed. I told him what the detective said. He listened without interrupting, without even blinking. She sold the house, I said softly. It was never just theft. She wanted to erase you. His hand trembled. I trained men to spot deception from a mile away. Didn't see it sitting across from me every night. You loved her, I said. He exhaled. I loved what I thought she was. Structure, calm, order. It was all theater. Guess I was the last to realize the play ended months ago. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then he said, I don't know how to rebuild from this. Good, I told him. That means we're starting honest. He looked at me with something raw in his eyes. Not command, not pride. Maybe, finally, trust. For the first time since returning, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt like a place waiting to breathe again. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. Half recovery, half recon. Every morning, he brewed coffee strong enough to peel paint, then retreated to the garage like it was his last command post. I'd leave for the outreach center, do my duty among other broken soldiers, then come home to find him still in the same chair, polishing ghosts. One night after dinner, he said, The bank called today. I froze mid-step. What for? They wanted to confirm the closing date. Closing? He stared at the floor. Elaine sold the house, 2 weeks before she disappeared. The sound that left my throat didn't belong to language. It was closer to disbelief colliding with fury. She forged your signature? He nodded once, ashamed. I thought I could fix it before you found out. I set the dish towel down, the hiss of steam from the sink filling the silence. Dad, I said quietly, this isn't about her anymore. It's about you not trusting anyone who doesn't wear a uniform. He winced but didn't argue. The next morning I went to the bank myself. The clerk, a tired woman in her 40s with the look of someone who's seen too many collapses, hesitated when I showed my ID. Lieutenant Commander Holbrook, she read softly, we spoke with your father earlier. He didn't authorize that sale, I said. Her mouth tightened. The paperwork looked legitimate. We only caught the discrepancy because of a flagged withdrawal. She slid a copy of the document toward me. My father's signature stared up from the page. Neat, deliberate, convincing. I'll need that file. I can't release it without a subpoena. Then pretend you didn't see me take a photo. She looked down, then away. I didn't see anything. Old habits die hard. When I got home, he was sitting in the garage again, wrench in hand, no project in sight. You went to the bank, he said flatly. Someone had to. He nodded, eyes on the floor. I trained men to spot deception. Didn't see it in my own house. Because you didn't want to, I said. You wanted to believe someone still needed you. He let out a broken laugh. Guess I'm the fool in uniform now. No, I said softly. Just human. He didn't answer, but for the first time, he didn't correct me either. That night, I sat by the window long after he went to bed. The wind had picked up, rattling the shutters. I thought about the day he'd thrown me out, how certain he'd sounded, how permanent the door had felt. And now here we were, in the same house, both of us exiled from the life he'd built. The next morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table, coffee mug untouched. He looked older than the sunlight allowed. They'll take the house, he said quietly. And after that, there's nothing left. There's always something left, I replied. We just have to decide what it's worth. He looked at me like he didn't believe it, but he didn't argue. Later that day, Marcus stopped by the center with 2 coffees and a question I wasn't ready for. You okay? I stared at the desk. Define okay. He leaned against the doorway. The kind that means you're sleeping, eating, not taking responsibility for the sins of every man you've ever known. Then no, he grinned softly. Didn't think so. We worked side by side for hours, processing claims, calling agencies, pretending life was manageable. But when the office emptied, he said, You ever think your father just doesn't know how to live outside a battlefield? I laughed without humor. That makes 2 of us. That evening, when I got home, my father was watching an old news segment, military funerals, slow salutes, folded flags. His eyes followed every motion like choreography he'd once mastered. Maybe you should come to the center, I said gently. Meet other veterans. See what's next. He shook his head. Those meetings are for men who've given up. Or men who finally stopped fighting the wrong war, I said. He didn't reply, but something in his jaw loosened. The next morning, I caught him outside at sunrise. He was standing barefoot on the lawn, the old flagpole creaking above him. The flag hung limp in the damp air, but he saluted anyway. Slow, deliberate, as if the gesture itself might hold the house together a little longer. When he lowered his hand, he noticed me in the doorway. Still standing watch, Commander? He asked. Someone has to, I said. He nodded once, the corners of his mouth twitching like he wanted to smile but couldn't remember how. A week passed. The detective called again. Elaine's car had been found abandoned at a motel in Maryland. No sign of her. The investigation was ongoing. I told my father over breakfast. He just stirred his coffee. Guess that's closure, he said. Closure isn't justice. Justice doesn't give you back your house. I reached across the table, covered his trembling hand with mine. You still have one, I said. We froze the sale. The bank's cooperating. His eyes glistened, but he blinked fast, unwilling to let anything fall. You did that? That's what daughters do when their fathers forget they raised fighters. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. The silence between us said it for him. That evening, he sat beside me on the porch, the sunset bleeding red across the trees. You ever regret joining the Navy? He asked suddenly. Not once, I said. Even with everything it cost you? Especially because of it. It taught me how to survive men like you. He laughed then, a real, unguarded laugh that startled both of us. Then he grew quiet again. I don't deserve this, he said softly. Maybe not, I answered, but you're getting it anyway. He nodded, watching the sky darken. Your mother would have liked seeing this. Maybe she's watching, I said. He smiled faintly. Then I hope she's proud of both of us. For the first time in years, we sat through a sunset without argument, without orders, without silence pretending to be strength. Just 2 people learning how to exist in the same light again. The next morning smelled like rain and reheated coffee. I woke early, half expecting to find him gone, but he was already dressed in slacks and a pressed shirt, sitting at the table, eyes fixed on the window. He looked like a man waiting for orders that would never come. I poured him a cup. You're quiet. Thinking. Dangerous habit, I said. He almost smiled. You sound like your mother. I sat across from him. You keep saying that like it's a warning. He didn't answer. The silence felt different this time. Less like a wall, more like a space where something new might grow. Later that morning, I went back to the outreach center. The place was buzzing, veterans filling the hallways, some looking for help, some just for a reason to keep breathing. Marcus was already there, sorting through forms. Morning, Commander, he said, holding up 2 coffees. One's even drinkable. Appreciate the sacrifice, I said. We fell into rhythm. Paperwork, calls, quiet jokes. Around lunch, he leaned against my desk. How's the colonel? Stubborn, I said. Still thinks vulnerability's a disease. Then you inherited it. Probably. He studied me for a moment. You know, not every battle needs a mission briefing. Spoken like a man who's never met my father. He grinned, but his eyes softened. Or like someone who's met too many men like him. When I came home that evening, the house smelled faintly of motor oil. I found my father in the garage again, polishing an old plaque. His name, rank, and the motto, Semper Vigilans, engraved in brass. Always vigilant. He ran a finger along the letters. You know, Elaine hated this thing, he said quietly. Said it belonged in a museum. Maybe it does, I replied, but it still means something. He looked up at me. Does it? All the years, the medals, the rules? I thought order was armor. Turns out it just keeps the wrong things out. I leaned against the workbench. Then maybe it's time to let something in. He didn't respond, but his shoulders eased, like the weight had shifted slightly from one side to the other. 2 days later, the detective called. Elaine had been arrested in Savannah. Fraud, identity theft, and enough charges to keep her grounded for years. She'd requested a meeting with him, face to face. I hesitated before telling him. "You don't have to go," I said. He stared at the wall. "Maybe I do." "Why?" He took a long breath. "Because I don't want the last thing I said to her to be silence." We drove south 2 days later. Marcus insisted on coming. "You two in the same car for 8 hours? That's a mission requiring backup," he said. The road stretched through pine forests and long miles of quiet. My father watched the trees blur past, lost somewhere between memory and regret. I didn't try to fill the silence. Sometimes presence was enough. Savannah greeted us with humidity and ghosts. The courthouse smelled of old paper and salt air. Elaine looked different, smaller, pale, her confidence leaking through the cracks. When she saw him, she whispered, "Richard." He didn't move closer, didn't even blink. The air between them was thick with years of misplaced trust. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said. "You meant to use me," he replied. "I loved you." He shook his head. "You loved the rank, the pension, the way my name looked on your mail." She started crying. "I was scared. I just wanted security." "You stole it," he said, voice calm, steady, "from the one person who earned it." The judge motioned for her to be escorted out. As she passed, she turned one last time. "I'm sorry." He met her eyes, then said quietly, "So am I." When the door closed, the sound felt final. The drive home was silent until we crossed the North Carolina line. Then, without looking at me, he said, "I thought facing her would fix something, but all I feel is empty." I nodded. "That's what happens after war. You win, but peace feels like loss." He looked at me, eyes tired but clear. "I used to think you were too soft for service. Turns out you're the only real soldier left in this family." I smiled faintly. "You're learning, Colonel." "Don't push it," he said, but his voice carried warmth I hadn't heard in years. Back home, the house felt different, lighter, as if something had finally exhaled. That evening, we sat on the porch while the sun dipped low. The sky burned gold and red over the trees. "You ever think forgiveness is contagious?" he asked quietly. "I think pride is too," I said, "but only one of them heals." He nodded, staring at the horizon. "You might be right." It was the closest thing to peace we'd ever had. 2 soldiers watching the day surrender without a fight. The morning after Savannah, the house felt different. The tension that had once clung to every wall like humidity was gone, replaced by something quieter, almost gentle. Dad moved slower now, but with a steadiness that looked earned. He brewed the coffee before I came downstairs. "Strong," he said, sliding a mug toward me. "Just how you like it." "Since when do you remember that?" I asked. He gave a faint grin. "Since I started paying attention." We drank in silence. For the first time, it wasn't an armed silence. It was something human. At the outreach center, Mrs. Dalton was waiting by my office. "How's he holding up?" "Surprisingly well," I said. "He's talking again, even making jokes. I'm still waiting for the apocalypse." She smiled. "It's not the end of the world, Avery. It's what the world looks like when people start forgiving each other." Before I could answer, Marcus appeared, holding a stack of flyers. "Fundraisers next weekend," he said. "Mrs. Dalton wants a speaker. Someone who can talk about rebuilding after loss." "I'll help you find one," I said quickly. He smirked. "She already found one. You." I laughed. "Hard pass." "Think about it," he said, leaving the flyers on my desk. "People listen to voices that survive storms." That evening, when I got home, Dad was watching the news. Veterans lining up for job programs, community centers opening across the state. His eyes stayed on the screen. "You work with these people every day," he said. "You ever tell them what it's like?" What's like?" "To lose everything you thought made you strong." I hesitated. Not exactly a motivational speech. Maybe it's the only one worth giving. He said it so simply, I almost missed the wisdom in it. The next few days, he surprised me. He started physical therapy. He called the VA himself. He even walked to the mailbox without pretending he didn't need the cane. Each small victory was a kind of salute. One afternoon, I drove him to the therapy clinic. The therapist, a young woman named Dr. Lynn, greeted him with a smile. "We'll take it slow, Colonel," she said. He stiffened. "Don't call me that. I'm just Richard now." "Then we'll take it slow, Richard." An hour later, he came out looking different. Softer around the eyes, like something had finally uncoiled. "She asked too many questions," he grumbled. "That's her job." She told me to write a letter to Elaine. Closure, she called it. "Are you going to?" He looked away. Maybe to your mother first. That night, I found him in the garage again, sitting beside his old Air Force trunk. In his hands was a photo of Mom, her smile easy, his younger self standing beside her, both of them still whole. She would have liked you, he said quietly. She raised me, I answered. He nodded. I used to tell her I'd never lose control. She said one day I'd meet someone who'd teach me what real control looked like. He chuckled softly. Guess she was right. I sat beside him. She usually was. He reached into the trunk and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal his medals. Bronze Star, Distinguished Service, decades of metal that had once meant everything. He handed it to me. These should have gone to your brother, he said. I smiled faintly, if I had one. Guess you got stuck with a daughter instead, he said. Guess you did. He looked at me, eyes glassy, and I'm grateful for it. For a long moment, we just sat there, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, the smell of metal and dust, the faint hum of the house at rest. Later, as we locked up the garage, he said something I didn't expect. You know, I used to think being a soldier meant protecting everyone. Turns out you were protecting me all along. I swallowed hard. We protect what's worth saving, Dad. He nodded slowly, eyes on the ground, voice barely above a whisper. Then I guess I was worth saving after all. That night, when I passed his room, he was already asleep. The photo of Mom sat on his nightstand beside a small lamp, and for the first time in years, his face looked peaceful. No command, no armor, just rest. The next morning, I stood in the doorway watching him breathe. For a man who had spent his entire life in control, peace was the rarest kind of bravery. When he woke, he caught me staring. Don't hover, Commander, he said with a smile. Just confirming the mission was still active. He laughed softly. Still is. A week later, the fundraiser arrived. The community hall was packed. Veterans in uniform, families with kids waving tiny flags, reporters setting up cameras. Mrs. Dalton introduced me with a proud smile. I walked to the podium, palms steady. I used to believe honor was something you proved in uniform, I began. But it's not. It's what you do when no one's saluting anymore, when you've been forgotten, and you still choose to stand. The room went still. Faces leaned forward, listening. I learned that from my father, I said, glancing toward the back. He stood there with his cane, straight-backed, proud. A man who taught me discipline, then forgot his own until he found it again, the hard way. I took a breath. Honor isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up. Sometimes it's about letting someone else help you do it. When I stepped away from the podium, applause rose slow, like rain building strength. My father waited at the aisle. He didn't say anything. He just lifted his hand in a salute, steady, deliberate. For a moment, the room disappeared. The lights, the noise, the years. All that existed was his salute and mine in return. It wasn't ceremony, it was homecoming. By the time summer reached Virginia, the air felt heavy with new beginnings. The grass in my father's yard grew wild again, but he didn't mind. Every morning he walked from the kitchen to the porch, cane tapping like a slow metronome, saluting the flag that hung limp in the humid air. He'd whisper call signs, old names, sometimes fragments of prayers. I never interrupted. It was his way of staying anchored, of keeping command over what little time he had left. One afternoon, I came home to find him at the dining table surrounded by papers, medals, and his laptop open to a document titled The Holbrook Initiative. What's this? I asked. He didn't look up. Our next mission, he said simply, a foundation to help veterans rebuild. You've been doing it for years. Now we make it official. I blinked. You mean like a charity? He nodded. Not charity, restoration. He smiled faintly. If we're lucky, we get one last mission before the lights go out. This is mine. It started small, paperwork, outreach calls, endless forms. But word spread fast. Donations trickled in. Local news covered our story. Estranged veteran father and Navy daughter reconcile to serve others. It sounded neater on TV than it felt in real life. But for the first time, his name didn't come with bitterness. It came with pride. The dedication ceremony took place in the old community hall where I'd once given my speech. Rows of flags lined the walkway, their fabric whispering in the wind. Inside, veterans and families filled every seat. When they called our names, we walked to the stage together. His steps were slow, but his back was straight. He gripped the podium, eyes scanning the crowd. I used to believe honor came from command, he said, voice steady. But my daughter taught me it comes from humility. I led men into war, She led me home. He paused, eyes shining. The world calls her Commander Holbrook. I just call her my second chance. The applause rose like thunder. I tried to hold it together, but when he reached for my hand, I felt the years between us collapse into a single moment of peace. When it was my turn, I faced the crowd. 2 years ago, my father gave me an ultimatum: serve his wife or leave his house. I chose silence. I thought I was walking away forever, but life has a strange way of calling us back. I looked at him. When pride breaks, when forgiveness becomes the only thing left to build on, you learn what family really means. The audience went still, every face caught in that fragile balance between grief and hope. Dad once told me a soldier's worth is in the corners: how we fold, how we stand, how we finish. Today, I think we finally squared ours. He smiled through tears. Yes, ma'am. After the ceremony, we walked through the foundation's new hall. Photos of veterans, quotes from families, a small plaque near the entrance that read, "Dedicated to those who lost their way and those who helped them home, in memory of Sarah Holbrook." He touched the plaque gently. "Your mother always wanted a home full of purpose," he said. "She got one," I replied, "and you built it." He looked at me, voice soft. "No, we built it." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and cut grass. He lifted his face to it, eyes closed, like a man finally free from formation. Weeks later, I found a letter on my desk in his handwriting. "Avery, if you're writing this, I probably took my final flight. Don't mourn. A soldier's duty is to finish the mission, and ours ended the moment you forgave me. Remember, command with compassion. Stand when it's hardest, and never salute without meaning it. You didn't just save me. You restored the name Holbrook. Love, Dad." I read it twice, folded it once, and slipped it into the pocket of my uniform jacket. It felt like the final order of a long campaign: clear, complete, merciful. That evening, I went to the outreach center. The sunset spilled through the windows in gold and crimson, the same colors that once painted our front porch. I walked to the flagpole outside, straightened the fabric where the wind had tangled it, and raised my hand in a slow, deliberate salute. Not as his daughter, not as a SEAL, but as a woman who finally understood that revenge had never been the mission. Redemption was. I looked up at the fading sky and whispered, "Mission complete, Colonel." Then I let the silence hold the rest.